Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Ensure Resilient and Agile Compliance in the Midst of Crisis. I'm Lois Engström, the Marketing Manager here at ClauseMatch, and today I'm joined by my colleague Rich Heller and GRC pundit Michael Rasmussen. I assume most of you know about Michael, but for those of you who don't, Michael is an internationally recognized pundit on governance, risk management and compliance. Michael helps organizations improve GRC processes, design and implement GRC architectures, and select solutions that are effective, efficient, and agile. He is a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor, and is noted as the father of GRC, being the first to define and model the GRC market in February 2002, whilst at Forrester Research. Today, Michael will explore how organizations can adapt their compliance programs in the midst of crisis, how they can navigate a changing landscape of business processes that need to remain compliant, how to communicate and engage remote employees on compliance, how to manage dynamic regulations as they adapt to crisis, and how to monitor compliance across a distributed workforce and business. So with no further ado, I would like to hand it over to Mr. Michael Rasmussen.
Be here today, and I look forward to spending this next virtual hour with everybody. And so today we're going to interact on the topic of ensuring resilient and agile compliance in the midst of a crisis. And let's move on to the next slide as we begin this. Today's organization, as I've stated in several of my other recent presentations, we are in the midst of navigating chaos. Now, we'll even step back outside of the current crisis, the current pandemic. Business is in a state of chaos within normal course of business. The organization is changing minute by minute, second by second. Regulations are changing. Global financial services firms are dealing with 220 regulatory change events every business day, coming from over 980 regulators around the world. Risk is changing, geopolitical risk and economic risk. And again, I'm just stepping outside the current pandemic and crisis. And so there's lots and lots of change happening to the organization. It's interconnected. There's nested supply chain, vendor, outsourcing, service provider, contractor, consultants, temporary workers, and everything's in a state of flux within business, just in the normal course of business. And that's chaos, just trying to keep all that change in sync. And in the context of the pandemic, it's just heightened, significantly heightened. Regulations are changing right now as we speak, to address the crisis. Some regulations are being lifted, others are being modified. Some regulations, we just need to remind people that, this is still something that you have to follow, even though you're working from home. Risk is changing, economic risks, geopolitical risks, shifts in technology and things as we move more towards work from home and have concerns there. And business itself is changing. We have shifting business processes as we deal with a distributed workforce that are working from home. We've got shifts in employees as people are wearing multiple hats as we've laid off people and reduced staff because not everybody is needed to support the business right now. Lots and lots of shifts in employees and responsibilities and roles. And we have to keep all of this in sync. And that's chaos in today's environment. And we might devote a ton of resources to be intelligent about the law and the regulation. But if that individual in that remote office environment isn't aware of their full responsibilities as they're now wearing multiple hats, and they're also working from home, and there's the regulatory requirements that need to be applied to a home office worker environment, such as like with the trader desks and things like that. How do you record phone calls and the communications and things with clients in a remote office environment? You've got to think through all those different little things, and things are shifting and changing so quickly. And that's navigating chaos. In the next slide, the physicist Friedrich Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. The physicist here is talking about biological ecosystems, but it applies so well to what we're seeing today in the course of business, whether it's the normal course of business or being able to ensure resilient and agile compliance in the midst of a crisis. We've got to be able to keep all these different threads of compliance in place, from things like GDPR and CCPA to UK SMCR. Operational resiliency, of course, is a huge topic. Market conduct, know your customers, and anti-money laundering. We've got to keep all these things in sync, but a lot of these things are changing to be applied to a new era of business, whether temporary to how long-term it'll be, we'll see, in the context of this crisis right now. And these are interconnected, interdependent themes. I was talking to one financial services firm that was having the challenge that in the midst of this crisis, they found out they have 20 different policy portals. And policies are changing right now, and risks to policies are changing. We need to effectively communicate policies to those remote office workers. And as the employees need to be reminded of the market conduct policy, the GDPR and CCPA and other privacy policies, and other policies are being revised, like the remote office worker and security and home office expense policies. They're finding there's 20 different policy portals throughout the environment, and policies are different on different portals, and they look different in different templates, use different language, and the organization is struggling to try to keep up with all these different policy portals and communicating changes to policies to remote office workers that need to be instructed and informed on compliance and what's expected of them right then at that moment. And that works against the organization. We have different ways to communicate compliance, like policies, to those individuals. We need to understand that these challenges that we're facing are interconnected, interdependent problems, and we need a singular strategy and approach to be able to address that. In the next slide. Leonardo da Vinci said, realize that everything connects to everything else. That it's an interconnected risk environment. The flutter of the butterfly's wings in the Netherlands makes tiny atmospheric changes that can influence the development and path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. We're seeing this played out right before us. The exposure to a virus in Asia has these implications that go around the world. And economies are being shut down, and we're having economic crisis. There's security risks from IT security and working at home. We have all these different cascading impacts of just what was originally just a health and safety event, cascades and balloons into all these other areas, and has this cascading impact on compliance and regulations and how we respond to compliance. In the next slide. Business is about managing uncertainty as we try to achieve our objectives. That's exactly what risk management is. ISO 31000 says that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. That we have to be able to manage the uncertainty, and that uncertainty is significant right now in organizations. That they are trying to manage a dynamic business environment, dynamic regulations and things, changing and adapting their business model and processes. The objectives themselves are changing, whether they're strategic, entity level objectives, division, department, process, or asset level objectives. All these objectives are changing, and we have to manage the uncertainty around that. And compliance doesn't like uncertainty. Compliance is about certainty. We want to make sure that things are being addressed, that we're meeting our compliance obligations. And uncertainty scares compliance. But we're in the midst of a lot of uncertainty right now, and we need structured processes with supported technology to be able to adapt compliance to this crisis, to become more resilient and agile in compliance in the midst of this crisis. In the next slide, we have to deal with a lot of change. And in fact, I would say outside of this crisis, but particularly inside this crisis right now, that change is the greatest challenge impacting compliance in this time of crisis. But even outside this crisis, the change is what hinders and complicates compliance. We got volumes of legal and regulatory change. As I stated, to use a Thomson Reuters figure, global financial services firms are dealing with 220 regulatory change events every business day. New laws, regulations, change laws, regulations, enforcement actions. Every business day, 220 regulatory change events around the world. But there's changes in the external risk environment. As we have market forces and economic changes that might impact our credit policies. We have geopolitical risk and things that impact our compliance posture and what's acceptable and unacceptable. We've got shifts in technology and things like with the Internet of Things. Think about it. Your remote office worker environment Businesses are dealing with this right now. Not every business has been structured to deal with a large home office worker environment. And so all of a sudden, business is being conducted in homes. Well, what about the Internet of Things with those TVs and microwaves and blenders and things that are connected to the internet that could expose your company's data? That's what chaos is like and change in trying to deal with compliance. My wife and I, we upgraded our blender at the Wisconsin State Fair in August. Our blender is connected. I can program it with my iPhone for different settings, for different shakes or whatever I want to blend. If there's a vulnerability or, heaven forbid, a Trojan horse in my blender in my apartment in Milwaukee, that could compromise my home network, which can compromise my data and my connections to clients or whatever it might be. And that's what we're dealing with right now in this external risk change and shifts in technology. We're moving so many people to a work from home office environment, but there might be security vulnerabilities and exposures in those remote office environments. And while we still have our compliance obligations like GDPR and CCPA and many others to ensure the confidentiality of information. And then there's a lot of internal business change, shifts in strategy right now, in processes, shifts in technology, employees. As I stated earlier, employees are under a lot of strain right now. They're concerned about their own health, their family's health. They're concerned about the economy, their future, their jobs. Some employees are getting laid off, which means that as we move to a remote office environment or whatever it might be, some employees are wearing multiple hats and there might be segregation of duty issues and things like that and conflicts of interest at some points. And people that are wearing multiple hats that they did not wear before, multiple roles and responsibilities, that is, they may not clearly understand the compliance requirements on all the roles and responsibilities they're being given in this change. But we still have to we still have to be compliant in the context of this. Change is the greatest challenge impacting compliance today. In the next slide, we need to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. That individual obligation or policy, as well as the interconnectedness of these obligations and policies to achieve compliance. We need to be able to see the tree in the forest. Now, I do a lot of workshops, and ClausMatch has sponsored many of these on policy management by design and compliance management by design and others. And I've been actually challenged on this slide a couple times by two global banks, one in a workshop in San Francisco, one in a workshop in London. They said the same thing. They said the reality in our environment is not just the tree and the forest, but it's the leaf as it connects to the branch and the branches as part of the tree. We've got to get down to the details. If that tree, as in what's before you in this slide, is that individual policy or that individual regulation, we've got to get down to the leaves and branches. We need to know that section and clause and that regulation change, which impacts that section and clause and that policy. It's not just about the trees and the forest, it's also about the leaves and the branches. And compliance needs this 360-degree contextual awareness and visibility into all the obligations and regulations and policies and controls in the environment to be able to see this contextually and understand these relationships. Next slide, please. But this becomes a significant challenge when organizations are managing compliance and a lot of manual processes with documents, spreadsheets, and emails. Things get missed. They slip through the cracks. Documents, spreadsheets, and emails do not provide the right audit trail for compliance, a system of record. I can completely manufacture evidence of compliance in documents, spreadsheets, and emails and make it look like there's a great compliance program. In reality, there's not. Regulators are catching up on this. External auditors, law enforcement are catching up on this. They want to be able to see that system of record and audit trail of who did what, when, how, and why on compliance. Who made that decision? What activity happened? How was it monitored? Did that individual read the policy? Did they understand the policy? Did they acknowledge the policy? Date, timestamp, some type of record of all these things is needed. Further, documents, spreadsheets, and emails are reactive and not proactive. I was talking to one firm. They were spending 200 employee hours to build a report for the board of directors for compliance. Just think about that. An annual report takes 200 hours to build the report on compliance for the board of directors. That's not managing compliance, that's reacting to compliance. If once a year I'm combing through all these documents, spreadsheets, and emails and tallying up figures and aggregating data and information to find out that I had an issue that started 11 months ago, and back then it was a small issue, but that compliance issue just grew and grew and grew and ballooned, and now it's a major big issue. Documents, spreadsheets, and emails are a recipe for disaster for compliance. It's reactive compliance management, not proactive compliance management. Furthermore, in the next slide, you've got the challenge of all the different portals and messages and policies and compliance communications in different formats. We have too many people sending too many messages in too many different ways. And it's happening time and again, just like that financial services firm I was referencing just a few minutes ago, that in the midst of this crisis, they're discovering that they have all these policies that are changing, other policies, and people need to be reminded that they need to comply with these policies. And they're scattered across 20 different portals in different templates and formats. And they're finding in a time of crisis, we need a singular view into all the corporation's policies and to be able to communicate effectively which ones have changed, which ones you need to be acknowledged, which ones you need to be reminded of. You know, but we lack that in a lot of organizations, that effective centralized compliance portal that brings all the policies, whether they're accounting policies or IT policies or market conduct policies or whatever they might be, into one central portal to engage employees on compliance. We're sending too many messages in too many different ways in the midst of a crisis, and things are bound to go wrong. And there's going to be mishaps and issues. Next slide, please. So we're moving from a past where compliance is in a lot of transition from old ways to new ways, where we're aiming for compliance agility. You know, that in the past, compliance was about a lot of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, to even like legal pads and paper trails and things like that, to a future where compliance is automated, monitored, there's centralized portal and communication, there's the leverage of artificial intelligence to understand, you know, changes in regulations and how that impacts my policies and controls for compliance and processes in the environment. We're moving from a past of responsibility for compliance to a future of accountability for compliance. You can outsource responsibility, but you cannot outsource accountability. And we have a whole set of accountability regimes like UK senior managers and certification regime, Hong Kong's managers in charge regime, Australia's banking executive accountability regulation, Ireland's senior executive accountability regulation, Singapore's and more. You know, we're seeing a greater focus on compliance as well from an accountability standpoint. Now, in the next slide, what's really critical in a time of crisis when it comes to compliance is that compliance itself is responsible for the integrity of the organization. And in that context, we need to really be focusing a lot on the culture. You know, in a time of crisis, we have a lot of concern. You have concern for the workforce culture. You know, people are in a different environment. They're working from home, not in the office. People are wearing multiple hats. They've seen their colleagues get laid off. They're concerned about the financial situation, the economy. They're concerned about the health and safety of them and their loved ones and their colleagues at work. You know, compliance needs to be there to be able to instill and show that the organization is there for the employees and that we're on top of this. You know, the organization itself isn't going to solve the world's problems by itself, but we're doing our part, and that the organization is there. And by the way, here's everything you need to know. All the policies and everything are in one place so that you have a central area of communication to understand what's expected of you in this time of crisis. Compliance is central to instilling a strong workforce culture. You know, of course, compliance is central to the ethical culture. What's right and wrong? Business is being done differently today than it was 2 months ago. People are working from home. We need to make sure people understand what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and unacceptable in their new office environments in their home office. And then even when things haven't changed, we need to remind people in a time of crisis, you know, and when there's economic crisis, there's a greater chance and likelihood of fraud and wrongdoing happening. People are scared. They will make decisions to try to protect themselves financially in things. And, you know, and good people that might have never broken the law, during the normal course of business might be tempted because of the constraints them and their families are under right now and the concern they have. And so we need to be able to strongly communicate policies and say, hey, this is serious and we're still monitoring this. The risk cultures are changing. What's acceptable and unacceptable risk? In some areas, we're seeing greater acceptance of risk because we have to, in the context of things like IT security in a work from home environment, where maybe the organization hasn't thought through everything and it doesn't have all the security controls it should need and doesn't have time to deploy them as they have to adapt to a changing environment. But we have changes in the risk culture of what's acceptable and unacceptable risk from like credit policies and things like that as we deal with the economic environment. And so we have to measure that. And then we have an overall governance culture. Organizations need strong tone at the top right now. That workforce out there and the employees needs to have confidence in the business, that the business is on top of things in this crisis and is addressing things, and to be able to ensure that confidence there. Compliance has a responsibility for integrity across these 4 elements of culture: the ethical culture, the risk culture, the governance culture, and the workforce culture in a time of crisis. Next slide, please. This means that compliance itself has to bring together a lot of different departments and functions to work cohesively. Now, my job is research, and I interact with a lot of organizations. My job is to be able to understand what keeps organizations up at night in the context of compliance, and how are they fixing this with strategy, process, and technology. And I've interviewed hundreds to thousands of firms over my 20-year career, and so I've interacted with a lot of companies. I have never met a chief ethics and compliance officer that is truly responsible and accountable for all of compliance. Compliance is a federated problem. There's lots of departments of compliance. The chief ethics and compliance officer might be responsible for the code of conduct, anti-bribery and corruption, antitrust, some big ticket compliance issues on market conduct and things like that. But then you have IT compliance. You got human resources compliance, dealing with child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage and hour. You got health and safety compliance, environmental compliance, quality compliance. You have lots of departments of compliance. It's the job of the central corporate compliance and ethics department with the chief ethics and compliance officer to be able to bring these other departments together to work together in common processes and strategy. I don't call it centralized because we're not trying to take all these different compliance functions that operate best in their respective departments. We're not trying to take them out of those departments and bring them into one department. We're trying to establish leadership from the chief ethics and compliance officer in the corporate compliance department to be able to work together across these departments, federated model that brings these different departments together to have a common strategy and process for compliance while allowing that domain expertise to reside in the departments where it functions best. We need collaboration on compliance strategy, process, and technology in a time of crisis. In the next slide, we also need a strong compliance culture with a top-down approach. As I was just stating, we need that compliance management strategy that brings these different departments together, has common processes for managing regulatory change, managing policies, a centralized portal to communicate policies, managing issues, investigations, and compliance assessments and regulatory exams, supported by a strong information technology architecture. Think about this in the context of other areas the business has tackled. The thing that comes top of mind is client relationship management, CRM systems. Back in the 1980s and before, we managed client relationships since the dawn of business. But it came to a point where things are becoming too dynamic and changing minute by minute, second by second. And in our client relationships, sales had their view of the client, marketing had their view of the client, service and support had their view of the client, and they all had different views. And nobody had a 360-degree view of the client. And CRM systems came to address that we'll have one platform that different departments can work with to be able to document and manage all these different client relationships and get 360-degree view into that client. The same thing is needed for compliance now, to be able to have that platform that brings together all the different compliance functions and departments, and so that we don't have 20 different policy portals. We have one portal for policies. We have one common investigation incident management system, issue reporting and hotline. We have these common management processes supported by common information technology that can work across compliance functions in different departments that's being led and facilitated by the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer in the Corporate Compliance Department. Next slide, please. When we're looking at a time of crisis, I encourage you to take on these 10 objectives for governance, risk, and compliance management in a time of crisis. Our objectives right now should be to reliably achieve business objectives. Now, those objectives are changing. Those might not be the same objectives you had 2 months ago because you had to adapt your objectives to the crisis and to a shifting economic environment. But we want to have common policies and controls and compliance processes to help the organization reliably achieve business objectives while staying within the boundaries of compliance. Compliance is there to help mitigate risk and uncertainty in a time of crisis. We want to be able to define and guide the organizational culture in a time of crisis. We want to increase stakeholder confidence in a time of crisis. We want to prepare and protect the organization while we're preventing, detecting, reducing exposure and weakness in a time of crisis. We want to motivate and inspire desired conduct in a time of crisis. We want to communicate those policies and make sure people understand what's expected of them in the remote office worker environment and the changes that are happening in the business. We want to provide consistent processes and behavior, because right now in a time of crisis with everything shifting to remote office worker environment, if compliance is not on top of this could be the Wild West. People can be going all sorts of directions and changing how their business behavior and things. And then all of a sudden we've stepped out of bounds and we're not compliant. We need consistent processes and behavior that compliance can govern properly. We need to improve responsiveness and efficiency and optimize the economic return and value of the organization. In the next slide, this requires monitoring. In a time of crisis, we need good external context monitoring and internal context monitoring. We need to monitor the changes in the laws and regulations in a time of crisis, the geopolitical and economic situation, shifts in industry practices and expectations, shifts right now in societal and environmental standards like personal protective equipment like safety masks and gloves and things and how those are being used. Technology advancements that are impacting this, as everybody moves to what we're on today, like with Zoom and conference calls, web calls and things. We need to monitor all this external context as well as the internal context. Shifts in our risk tolerance that impacts our policies. Shifts in the governance culture of the organization. Adjustments to the strategic and operating plans, and the shifts in the workflow forces. Employees their roles are changing right now, and their responsibilities are changing, and some are being laid off, and others are giving more responsibilities. We need to be able to monitor both the external and internal context of the environment, and funnel this into our compliance radar, which then, in the next slide, we can see and understand the different organizational changes, the regulatory and risk change impacting our policies and controls for compliance in the organization, understand the synergies and relationships, because there might be multiple changes that impact one policy or one control area, and identify the compliance changes that need to happen. In the next slide, this requires that we have the capability to be able to take in a lot of distributed and disconnected compliance information, synthesize and integrate and contextually understand this and map this together, analyze those relationships and build out action items. Now, artificial intelligence specifically has a critical role in being able to deliver and address this. And so those action items coming from our radar, monitoring the external and internal context, then flow into the next slide where that comes in, and how do we monitor these changes and understand how they align with our mission, vision, and values, our strategy and shifts to the strategy in a time of crisis, our evolving business processes such as work from home and things like that, and roles and responsibilities, understand our overall risk exposure, and identify the policies that need to be changed and how they need to be communicated. And not just to identify the policies that need to be changed, but also what policies do people need to be reminded of. The policy might never have changed, but we need to remind people about this policy in a time of crisis as well. Next slide, please. This gets into our compliance implementation communication plan in a time of crisis, that we understand how are we going to implement and manage compliance in this time of crisis during a pandemic, What are the different areas of responsibilities and shifts that are happening, what's happening with changes in laws and regulations and its impact on the organization and processes. Once we understand the implementation plan and how business is going to be changing during this time of crisis, we build in the communication plan. How do we communicate this? How do we communicate this to senior managers? How do we communicate this down to the workforce, the frontline employees? What are the different types of communications? And then how do we deliver training? And what's the implementation plan for this? What type of approvals need to be received from people that authorize the plan to the people that have to respond to the compliance communications out there, and any other considerations? Part of the compliance communication plan we see in the next slide, needs to clearly understand what are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? And part of those goals is understanding who our audience is. We might have high risk individuals in our audience, medium risk individuals, low risk individuals, no risk individuals. I'll talk about that in a few slides. But who are our audience? And what are our goals for those different levels of audience in the organization? And how do we communicate those compliance practices and processes in that context? What are the resources that we need to communicate to those audience and engage those audience and to achieve those goals? Do we make compliance accessible in different languages and formats? And what's the level of mobility that we can communicate and push policies out there to mobile devices and things as well? And what are the metrics we're going to measure compliance around during this time of crisis? And align our program and get buy-in from internal stakeholders. In the next slide, this all moves into understanding that communication plan, authorizing it, and then understanding out there in the frontline employees, whether they're in the traditional office environment or business environment, because some businesses are essential and they still have people coming into the office, while others, are working from home. And those wherever the people are, who do we just need to distribute communications to? That, there's a change policy here, or you need to be reminded of this policy, just be aware of it. And then which ones need some level of acknowledgement? Here's the change policy, or revised policy, or new policy, or we're just reminding you of this policy. We need you to acknowledge, certify, attest it. And then what ones require training? Now, in the next slide, that's the key thing, is understanding that you might have one compliance policy. Let's pick GDPR or market conduct or money laundering or whatever it might be. And you have different roles. That some roles are high relevance roles. They're where the greatest compliance exposure can happen right now. I mean, you can think about this like in the health and safety context. You take something like a hospital environment. Those doctors and nurses are those high relevant roles that need to understand everything around the policies on patient safety and their own personal safety in the time of crisis. Now, those in the call center, that are in the back office, those are low relevance roles for that area. They still have concern because things because we have exposure no matter where we're at when it comes to like the crisis. But the people on the front lines that are dealing with the sick in this crisis are high relevance roles, while the people in the back office, maybe even working from home, in the call center of a hospital, are going to be low relevance roles. And so you have different roles that impact compliance, whether it's like patient safety or personal safety in a time of crisis, to market conduct, to privacy like GDPR and CCPA. There's different types of roles that are at different levels of exposure that might require different levels of training, communication, acknowledgement on policies for compliance in the normal course of business, but today in the context of a crisis. Next slide, please. We should also clearly understand compliance in the 3 lines of defense. The first line of defense is the frontline employees. They're dealing with compliance day in and day out. That teller at the bank, the insurance agent out there in the field, they're making compliance decisions throughout the course of the day, every business day, as a frontline employee. But then you have the second line of defense, which most of us on the phone are probably from that second line. We're managing compliance. We have to understand the regulatory change and what policies need to be revised, how to communicate those policies. We're managing and monitoring, keeping compliance current in the environment, and engaging the first line of defense. But then we also have the third line of defense, audit. Audit, and it provides assurance that the organization is meeting its compliance obligations and that things aren't slipping through the cracks. Audit's there to make sure that the second line of defense is doing its job and that the first line of defense is engaged in following the requirements. Next slide, please. When it comes to compliance communications, we have a push and a pull mechanism. You know, the pull is where that employee out there in the remote office environment is saying, you know, what is that home office expense policy? Can I expense my paper now that I have to work from home and I'm not working in an office right now? You know, my printer paper, whatever it might be. You know, they're going to go out and find the answer. They're going to look for that portal for policies. Now, if we have 20 different portals, that employees can get frustrated quickly as they try to say, which portal is this particular policy on, and how do I find it? But we have that policy pull where the employees are going and trying to find the answers to their questions and their particular need. The policy push is where we are communicating changes or awareness of policies for compliance out to the employees. You know, here's the revised market conduct policy. In this time of crisis, you know, you need to acknowledge this, and we're pushing them out to the employees. But in the next slide, this all requires that we have a strong compliance portal that can engage the employees, a portal that is intuitive, modern, easy to use, adaptive, personal, accessible, that portal is strong on the laptop and desktop, to the tablet, to the mobile device, so that individuals and employees can get those policies and their questions answered whenever or wherever they are at. It also requires, in the next slide, that we have a strong, under 360-degree contextual intelligence of compliance and policies, that we understand things in context, that we understand the obligation, like the regulatory obligation, and what policies relate to that regulation. And when that regulation changes, what policies to be revised, where in the organization that regulation applies to and that policy applies to, how that policy helps us reliably achieve objectives, how that policy addresses specific risks like market conduct risks or money laundering risks or privacy risks. Every policy in the organization, doesn't matter what department it's in, whether it's an HR policy, an accounting policy, a compliance and ethics policy, every policy is a risk document. There wouldn't be a policy unless there was a risk. And that risk was significant enough that some individual had to codify behaviors to control that risk and write it in a policy. You know, policies are mapped to controls. Those, your password policy tells you length of password, frequency of change of password, complexity of password. These are controls in your environment. Your credit policy tells you the amount of credit and who you can extend credit to. Those are controls in your environment. Issues, incidents, cases, investigations, those are often violations of policies. And can we mine that information? Are we hiring bad, wicked, evil people that want to do very bad things? Maybe, but it could be that in a time of crisis, that individual didn't know what was required from them and just stepped out of bounds. And if we would have communicated that policy that was already there, they would have known. We need a strong information architecture that can map and understand policies and compliance obligations in context. To advise the organization and keep it on its path in the time of crisis and outside time of crisis. In the next slide, we also need strong technology to manage and implement and enforce compliance and policies in a time of crisis, to look for compliance failures, policy violations, exceptions and deviations from policies that are being approved because of the revised working conditions and things like that. And that all needs to be documented with a strong evidence trail and system of record. That leads us to technology in the next slide, that we need engaging agile compliance technology. Technology that is usable for the back office, like the second and third line of defense, but also usable to be engaged by the frontline employees in the first line of defense. That they can find that information when they need it, where they need it. It's in a modern user interface that is highly intuitive and engaging, that has a low total cost of ownership. It doesn't take 2 or 3 years to roll out. And configure and build out, but it has a much more rapid time of deployment and lower total cost of ownership. It's highly configurable, scalable, adaptable, can integrate with other systems like HR systems and things and pick up employee role changes and things and send off policies and tasks related to those roles. Has deep analytics and leveraging artificial intelligence and robotic process automation, such as natural language processing, to be able to map policies to regulations and things to maintain compliance, and is simple to upgrade and future-proof. In the next slide, we need technology, again, that engages the front lines of the organization, that's bringing compliance down to those frontline employees. whether it's in the logistic environment, whether it's in the healthcare environment, whether it's the frontline employees, the teller at the bank, the insurance agent out there in the field, the coal miner down in the coal mine. We need compliance technologies like that portal for policies and things that engages the first line of defense, the frontline employees, wherever they're at, whenever they're at. In the next slide, we need strong technology that allows for collaboration, where corporate compliance and ethics can collaborate with HR compliance, can collaborate with IT compliance, can collaborate with health and safety and environmental and other areas of compliance, so we can work together. So we don't have 20 different portals for policies and compliance. We have one singular portal that employees can be engaged on. And the next slide, where we can operationalize and automate processes and pick up changes in context, like if somebody has a new role or responsibility and they need to be aware of these policies in the context of that role and responsibility. In the next slide, being able to leverage technology and innovation to leverage things like artificial intelligence, so that when the regulation changes, we understand what policies need to be reviewed and revised in context of that regulation. Use natural language processing to be able to help map that and simplify compliance's role there. Not eliminate it, but simplify it and streamline it. Now, in the next slide, it's important to understand that mobility is also critical. We need to bring compliance anytime, anywhere, any place. That employees can access, that portal, report issues on compliance, whether they're out there in the front lines and the remote office worker environment, wherever they're at, that, we have engaging mobile experiences as well. And my final slide, Agile compliance in today's day and age, delivers on these elements. It helps us become more aware of all of our regulations and how they map to policies, and when one area changes, what other cascading impacts and changes need to happen. That allows us to align and work together collaboratively in a federated approach to compliance, which enables us to become more responsive, to identify issues and contain them when they're still small issues, instead of letting them grow to become big issues because we have a reactive approach and not a proactive approach. All this then delivers agility, that we can keep up with business change in a time of crisis and keep compliance up to date and active as business processes and employee roles are changing in a time of crisis, which then leads to operational resiliency as well as efficiency. So with that, I'd like to turn this back over to Rich and Lois to hear some of ClausMatch's views.
Thank you, Michael. Lois, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great, thanks. Thanks again, Michael. So just to summarize some of the challenges that we heard Michael talk about, we wanted to kind of put them into a few buckets here, and they're separated by some things you heard during the presentation today. And so the first bucket, are we in control, and linking regulations and policies and controls across a business and understanding the impact of the business units and the products. And we see this time and time again with the clients that we're working with across multiple industries, and they're struggling with trying to maintain the connections with the changes and the fast changing environment in the current crisis with regulations, and implementing those regulations across their policies and procedures, and how did they align with any impact on their obligations, and who's going to have responsibility for that. So that's a real challenge. And then, secondly, are employees aware of, what is relevant, and how can they answer any regulatory policy and procedural based questions? Obviously, with this crisis, there's been a big change on how people are working and working remotely, and what impact that has on, business continuity. And so, the challenges there exist for compliance teams to be able to make sure employees are using the right tools. Many organizations were using one online platform and had to change quickly to another one because of security issues. How do you communicate that, and how do you collaborate that? And then, evidencing back to regulators on and making sure that policies are up to date and having a full audit trail. So these are some of the typical challenges that we see. On the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about how ClausMatch solves this and helps your compliance department evolve and really become the solution that Michael outlined so elegantly as far as Agile compliance. So Clause Match has a robust policy communication portal that allows that communication and search capabilities for your employees to easily find policies, but also allows that pushing of those policies for them to be able to distribute and certify. Our policy management platform, it provides a real-time workflow that's collaborative and is very granular at the paragraph level. And then finally, we can map those regulatory compliance initiatives with the regulations as they change and map them across your entire compliance policies, procedures, controls, and identify those obligations. And this is all managed through the entire process with empowered by artificial intelligence and natural language processing. So on the next slide, I just wanted to dig into one area that we have done a very good job of providing a policy communication portal that is accessible not only on web browsers, but also in a mobile fashion, so it has complete flexibility. And really, it's a single portal that provides the right people with the right access to the right information at the right time. And it can be all controlled by your organization. And the policy portal has the full flexibility to be branded with your logos and colors. It can require the right attestation for those users and make sure they've read and understood that document and have the ability to report on it. And then once the documents are finalized on the policy management platform, they can be published right into the policy portal. So that just gives you insight into one way that we're helping our customers streamline and be able to help with the communication challenges in the current crisis.
Michael, Rich, thank you very much for sharing your insights and knowledge with us today. For all of you listening, I hope you enjoyed this webinar. And please do visit clausematch.com. Under resources there's a tab called events where you'll find our past events, but also our future events and webinars. And we hope you're able to make the next one. So thanks again to all of you for listening. If you do have any questions, there will be a follow-up email with the presentation slides. And if you reply to that one with a question, we'll make sure to get back to you very soon. Please, everyone, do take care. And I hope to see you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.